The sun had barely risen when Steven Seagal stepped out of a black SUV and walked toward the glass doors of his own luxury car dealership. No cameras, no security team, no announcement. Just Steven in plain clothes, a faded cap, a loose black jacket, and worn-in boots. He looked more like a quiet traveler than the owner of a multimillion-dollar business. And that was exactly the point. 4 weeks, complaints had quietly piled up on his desk. Ignored customers, rude staff, hidden fees suddenly appearing in paperwork. Nothing dramatic enough to make headlines, but troubling enough to bother him deeply. Steven believed in fairness, in respect, in treating people right. And something told him the dealership wasn't living up to that. So today he wanted to see the truth with his own eyes. He pushed the glass door open. A bell chimed softly. Inside, the showroom gleamed, rows of polished SUVs, sports cars, and luxury sedans lined up like trophies. Yet the atmosphere felt strangely cold. A group of employees at the front desk were laughing loudly about something on someone's phone. None of them looked up to greet him. Steven slowly walked past them unnoticed. A middle-aged man in a suit browsed near a blue SUV, clearly needing assistance. He glanced toward the employees several times, but no one bothered to approach him. A young couple at the far side waited holding brochures, whispering to each other, looking confused about where to go. Steven observed silently. He walked up to a nearby display car, pretending to examine the interior, while he really listened to how the staff interacted with customers. A salesman leaned back in his chair scrolling on his phone. Another employee joked loudly, "People who come early are usually broke. They'll waste our time." Steven's jaw tightened, but he remained calm. He watched as a woman in a business suit approached the front desk with a polite smile. "Excuse me, I'm here to see the model you advertised." Before she finished, an employee waved a hand dismissively. "Ma'am, appointments only. We're busy." Busy? They were doing nothing. Steven took a deep breath. This wasn't bad service. This was disrespect. And he hadn't even seen the worst part yet. Steven moved slowly through the showroom, pretending to examine the steering wheel of a luxury sedan while he watched the behavior around him unravel. He had owned businesses long enough to recognize the signs of a team that had grown lazy, entitled, and careless. The kind that felt untouchable when the boss wasn't around. But today the boss was around. They just didn't know it. A salesman in a slim gray suit finally noticed Steven lingering near the car. He sighed as if inconvenienced, stood up lazily, and sauntered over. Without even making eye contact, he muttered, "Test drives are reserved for serious buyers only." Steven looked at him calmly. "I didn't ask for a test drive. Just had a few questions." The salesman exhaled loudly, annoyed. "Look, sir, these aren't cheap cars. People usually come in after doing research. If you don't know what you're looking for, maybe you should try a standard dealership first." Steven raised an eyebrow but said nothing. He simply nodded and stepped aside. Behind him, he heard the salesman whisper to another employee, "Another window shopper. Probably just wants to sit in a fancy car for a selfie." They chuckled. Steven continued walking. At the opposite end of the showroom, a young couple stood near an SUV marked Family Package. They looked uncertain, holding a printout of online details. The couple kept glancing toward the staff, hoping someone would help. But no one did. Steven approached them quietly. "Need assistance?" he asked gently. The husband smiled awkwardly. "Yeah, we've been trying to get someone's attention for 10 minutes. Steven nodded, the irritation in his chest tightening. "Just stay patient," he said. "Let's see who's willing to work today." Before he could say more, one of the employees shouted from across the room, "Hey, don't bother the customers, okay? We'll handle them." Steven turned slowly toward the voice. A young salesman with slick hair was walking over, smirking slightly. "Sir," he said, addressing Steven like a nuisance, "we appreciate you browsing, but please don't interfere with others." "Interfere?" Steven repeated quietly. "Yes, some people are actually here to buy." The implication hung in the air. The young couple exchanged an uncomfortable glance. The salesman stepped between them and Steven as if guarding them. "Let me help you folks," he told the couple, suddenly turning kind and professional, now that he believed they might buy something. Steven walked away, not because he accepted the disrespect but because he wanted to see just how deep the rot went. He didn't have to wait long. Nearby, a single mother walked in holding her daughter's hand. She looked tired but hopeful. "Hi," she said to a desk clerk. "Do you have any certified pre-owned cars under the discount program? I saw an ad online." The clerk didn't even smile. "We don't have time for bargain hunters today." The woman blinked. I just wanted to ask what models are available. The clerk waved dismissively. All sold out. Try the used lot down the road. Steven's jaw clenched again. He had specifically instructed his team to help single parents, budget buyers, veterans, anyone who needed honest guidance. His dealership was supposed to be known for respect, transparency, humanity. But today, it felt like the opposite. As the woman walked away, Steven approached the desk clerk. Quick question, he said softly. That discount program, why'd you tell her it's unavailable? The clerk rolled his eyes. Because it's a waste of time. People who ask for discounts never buy anything. Steven stared at him for a long moment. So you just send them away? Yeah. Easier that way. A slow breath escaped Steven's chest. He took another step deeper into the dealership, watching everything. Listening. Observing the arrogance, the lies, the coldness. Then, as if fate wanted to show him one more glimpse of the truth, the same gray suit salesman approached him again. Sir, he said bluntly, my manager says you've been walking around too long without asking for help. If you're not buying something, maybe the cafe across the street is more your style. Steven looked at him, expression steady, voice calm. What makes you think I can't buy something here? The salesman shrugged. I can always tell. Steven didn't respond. He didn't need to, because now he had seen enough. The dealership wasn't broken. It was rotting from the inside. And Steven Seagal had just decided the reckoning would begin today. Steven stood in the center of the showroom, letting the last insult settle into silence. He wasn't angry, not the kind that showed anyway. His calmness was the kind that made people uneasy. The kind that meant he was thinking, measuring, assessing consequences. And consequences were coming. He watched as the arrogant clerk returned to his desk and began gossiping loudly with two other employees, laughing about the cheap customers who had walked in earlier. One even imitated the single mother's voice, mocking her for asking about discounts. Steven's eyes darkened. He turned his attention back to the young couple from earlier. They were now sitting awkwardly at a sales desk while the slick-haired salesman pushed papers at them. Steven had sharp hearing. Even from a distance, he could catch the tone of deception. You'll need to sign this, the salesman said with fake enthusiasm. It includes the standard prep fee and the dealership assurance package. The husband frowned. Prep fee? The website said the price was inclusive. Oh, it is, the salesman lied smoothly. These are optional, but the car can't be released without them. Company policy. Steven had created no such policy. He stepped closer, pretending to browse nearby while listening. What's the assurance package? The wife asked. The salesman waved it off. Just routine stuff, don't worry about the details. Steven felt his patience snap. He approached the desk. The salesman glared at him but forced a smile at the couple. Sir, he said through clenched teeth, I told you not to interrupt customers. Steven ignored him completely and looked at the couple kindly. You two seem unsure. Did he explain the fees? The salesman straightened. They understand perfectly. And again, sir, please stop disturbing. Steven raised a hand gently, cutting him off. His expression was firm now, no longer the casual observer. That's not an assurance package, Steven said. It's a pile of unnecessary charges added without approval. The couple blinked, startled. The salesman's face tightened. All right, enough. I don't know who you think you are, but... You're right, Steven said. You don't know who I am. But that's about to change. Before the salesman could react, another voice cut through the tension. Hey! A harsh voice barked from across the showroom. A different employee, a tall man with a loud presence, walked over. He had been watching from a distance, clearly irritated by Steven's involvement. What's going on? He demanded. The slick-haired salesman pointed at Steven aggressively. This guy has been walking around all morning acting like he owns the place. Steven stared at him, not with anger but with a quiet, controlled authority that made the man hesitate. The tall employee stepped closer. Sir, I'm going to ask you kindly to leave. You're disrupting our business. Steven tilted his head slightly. Your business? Or mine? The tall employee scoffed. Okay, pal. You've got 2 seconds to walk out or I'll have security escort you. A few customers turned toward the commotion. The single mother who had been dismissed earlier paused near the entrance, watching nervously. The older man browsing the SUV stared, sensing something wasn't right. Even the staff at the front desk looked over, whispering. The tall employee leaned in. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. Steven straightened, not aggressively, but with a presence that shifted the entire room's energy. My suggestion, he said softly, is that you lower your voice and take a step back." The tall man laughed. "Or what? You'll call my boss?" Steven's expression didn't change. "Something like that." A low tension rippled through the air. The employees weren't dealing with an angry customer. They were dealing with a man who was done observing and ready to act. The tall employee jabbed a finger toward the door. "Last chance, old man. Either walk out or—" Steven didn't flinch. "If you point that finger at me again, you won't like what comes next." The room went dead silent. No yelling. No threats. Just calm, undeniable authority. The tall employee faltered, suddenly unsure. Because something in Steven's eyes, steady, unblinking, warned him that this was no ordinary customer. This was someone who had seen far worse than a rude salesman. Nearby, the young couple whispered, "Who is he?" But before anyone could answer, the situation escalated even further. A mechanic from the service bay rushed into the showroom, eyes wide. He froze when he saw Steven. And the look on his face said everything. Because he knew exactly who was standing there. And his single whisper would change the entire dealership forever. The mechanic stood at the edge of the showroom, frozen mid-step. His coveralls were stained with grease, and his hands still held a wrench, but his eyes were fixed on Steven, wide with shock. "Sir?" he said quietly, almost whispering. The tall employee turned, annoyed. "What now? Go back to the service bay. We're handling this." But the mechanic didn't move. He didn't blink. He didn't even breathe. "Is that," he began, voice trembling. "Is that Steven Seagal?" The entire room shifted. The slick-haired salesman's smirk faded. The tall employee's posture stiffened. The customers paused mid-sentence. Even the front desk staff stopped laughing. A strange silence rippled across the showroom. The tall employee scoffed loudly, trying to cover his sudden discomfort. "Steven Seagal? Where? You think the real Steven Seagal would be dressed like that?" The mechanic gulped. "He owns this dealership. For 15 years. A wave of realization hit the room like a shockwave. The rude staff's faces drained of color. The young couple gasped. The single mother near the entrance covered her mouth. The older man browsing the SUV let out a soft, "I knew he looked familiar." But Steven didn't say a word. He simply watched them, not triumphant, not angry, just observing the unfolding truth. The tall employee's voice cracked slightly. No, he doesn't. I mean," he turned to Steven. "This is some kind of joke, right?" Steven didn't answer. Instead, the mechanic stepped forward, wiping his hands nervously on his work pants. "Mr. Seagal," he said respectfully, "Sir, if I'd known you were here I would've." Steven raised a hand gently. "You did nothing wrong." The words echoed loudly in a room where many people had done something wrong. The slick-haired salesman swallowed hard. His confidence evaporated. He slowly lowered the stack of papers he had been forcing onto the young couple. I didn't realize," he stammered. Steven looked at him, eyes calm but heavy with disappointment. "That's the problem," he said quietly. "You don't realize who people are until you decide whether they're worth your time or not." The tall employee's voice trembled. "Sir, I apologize if—" Steven turned his head slightly. "If—" The employee took a shaky breath. "If we misjudged you." Steven's silence was more damaging than any anger could have been. Customers began whispering. "That's him. That's really him. Is this why the service has been so bad lately? No wonder people left bad reviews." The staff panicked. Suddenly, the same clerk who had mocked the single mother earlier sprinted over to her, forced a smile and chirped, "Ma'am, looks like we actually do have some discount options for you." The mother blinked skeptically. "Now you do." Steven's voice cut through the awkwardness. "Don't insult her intelligence. Or mine." The clerk froze. Steven walked toward the center of the showroom, his presence commanding without being loud. The staff formed a nervous semicircle around him, while customers remained close enough to watch. For the first time all morning no one spoke over him. No one dismissed him. No one rolled their eyes. They just waited. Because now they knew the truth. The old man wasting time was the owner. Their employer. The man who had given them jobs. And they had treated him with the same disrespect they showed countless customers. The mechanic lowered his head. "Sir, I'm sorry you had to see this." Steven finally spoke. "I didn't come as your boss," he said steadily. "I came as a customer. And what I saw today," he scanned the room, eyes moving from face to face, "would embarrass any business owner." Several employees shifted uncomfortably. Some looked down. Others whispered desperate excuses. Steven wasn't interested in excuses. He stepped closer to the group and said with calm authority, "Your job isn't to judge people. It's to help them. Every single one." Those words hit harder than shouting ever could. The tension in the room grew thick, heavy, undeniable. The staff knew something big was coming. Something they couldn't talk their way out of. Because Steven Seagal had seen everything. And he wasn't leaving until every wrong was corrected. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as Flight 482 continued slicing through the thin air over the North Atlantic. The tension that had briefly eased after the captain's announcement was slowly creeping back into people's expressions. Steven Seagal remained seated, his large frame steady, his eyes fixed forward, not in fear but in a deep, calculating calm that only years of discipline could produce. Chief Purser Daniel returned from the cockpit, his expression serious but controlled. He walked straight to Steven. "Sir," he said quietly, "the captain wants to thank you for your assistance earlier. He also asked me to share the updated status with you, in case you notice passengers reacting." Steven nodded once. "Go ahead." Daniel took a breath. "The satellite link we use for some instrument redundancy, it's dropping in and out. Not a full failure but unstable. It's affecting some secondary data streams. The flight computer is handling most of it, but the captain wants manual oversight for safety." Steven understood the implication. "So the pilots are hand-flying more than usual?" "Yes." Daniel kept his voice low. "Nothing dangerous yet. Just more workload." Steven nodded slowly. "They'll manage. They're trained for this." Daniel allowed himself a small exhale. "Yes, sir." But not everyone shared that confidence. Row 33, where the earlier confrontation took place, had become a quiet zone of nervous whispers and stares. Passengers who had witnessed the flight attendant slap the child still seemed shaken. The mother hadn't spoken much since being moved, but her son kept glancing back with wide, confused eyes. Meanwhile Meryl, the flight attendant who started it all, had returned from her mandatory cool-down period. Her face was pale, her hands trembling slightly as she arranged snacks on a trolley. She avoided eye contact with passengers, flinching at even the slightest movement. It was clear she was crumbling inside. When she passed Steven, her steps hesitated, but she forced herself forward. "Ma'am," Steven said calmly. She froze. "Why yes. You can look at me. I'm not here to make this worse." Her eyes darted up then down again. I didn't mean to cause trouble." "You did," he said bluntly but not harshly. "But trouble can be fixed. Panic cannot." Meryl swallowed hard. "I know." "Then focus," Steven said. "Your crew needs you. Passengers need calm. Even one shaky person can affect the whole cabin atmosphere." Her lip trembled. "I'm trying." "Try harder," Steven replied, not cruel, simply direct. "You're trained for high pressure. Use that training." Meryl nodded quickly, almost gratefully, and pushed the trolley forward. Across the aisle, an elderly man leaned toward Steven. "Young people today," he muttered, shaking his head. "No backbone." Steven turned to him. "Everyone has a breaking point, sir. Some people just reach it sooner." The old man blinked, then gave a slow nod of reluctant agreement. Just then, ding. The seatbelt sign illuminated again. A ripple of unease spread through the aircraft. Daniel immediately made an announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are expecting a zone of moderate turbulence. Please remain seated and keep your seatbelts fastened." But the tone, the slight tightness in his voice, passengers felt it. Steven leaned back, bracing his long legs as the aircraft began to rumble. Overhead bins vibrated softly. A few gasps echoed. Then, one sharp drop. A classic air pocket. Not dangerous, but the suddenness sent a jolt through everyone. A baby cried. Someone cursed under their breath. A teenager grabbed the seat in front of him. Steven remained perfectly still. But several passengers kept glancing at him, somehow comforted simply because he wasn't panicking. His reputation, his calm aura, his physical presence, it mattered. During another jolt, a tray of sealed water bottles slid off the galley counter and clattered to the floor. Meryl jumped, startled, but caught herself quickly, kneeling to pick them up. Daniel shot her an approving look. She steadied. The turbulence finally eased after several long minutes, and the cabin lights brightened again. Conversations resumed, quietly, cautiously. People were trying to convince themselves that the worst was over. But Steven knew better. He'd been around too many pilots, too many military flights, too many operations with unpredictable variables. The sky was vast, powerful, and different. Technology helped. Skill helped. But sometimes, nature simply had its own plans. He closed his eyes for a moment, centering his breathing. When he opened them again, Daniel was approaching a second time, this time with a different expression. Not panic, but urgency. Sir, the captain requests your assistance again. Steven stood. Lead the way. And for the first time since takeoff, the cabin fell completely silent. Everyone watched him walk toward the cockpit. Something real was happening. Something serious. And everyone knew. This was only the beginning. The narrow hallway leading to the cockpit felt unusually quiet as Steven walked behind Daniel. The faint hum of the engines vibrated through the metal flooring, steady but somehow heavier than before. Daniel tapped twice on the reinforced cockpit door. A soft click followed, and it opened just wide enough for Steven to slip inside. The cockpit of Flight 482 was bathed in cool blue lighting, rows of instruments glowing like a living organism. Captain Reynolds sat in the left seat, hands firm on the controls. His first officer, Malik Qureshi, was scanning the overhead panel with sharp, trained movements. Both men looked tired but alert. Mr. Seagal, the captain said without looking away from the windshield, "Thank you for coming." Steven nodded. "What's the situation?" Malik slid a sheet of paper toward him, a printout of diagnostic codes. "We've lost stable connectivity on one of our secondary satellite channels. It's not catastrophic, but it's affecting the flow of long-range positional data." Steven studied it. He wasn't a pilot, but he'd been around enough operations to know what mattered. "And the turbulence?" he asked. "That's the second problem," Captain Reynolds said. "The system that feeds weather mapping to our display is sluggish. The delay is making it hard to read real-time wind shifts." "So you're basically flying blind on weather updates?" Steven summarized. "Not blind," Malik corrected, "but nearsighted." The captain let out a slow exhale. "What concerns me is the pattern. 2 separate outages, both intermittent, both unusual." Steven leaned closer, lowering his voice. "Equipment failure?" Malik shook his head. "Possible. But our maintenance logs from London were clean." Captain Reynolds finally turned to Steven. "I need you for something very specific. And I'm aware it sounds unconventional." Steven raised one eyebrow. "Go on." "A cabin threat assessment," the captain said. "We can't afford any internal disruptions right now. If anything else happens, another outburst, a panic incident, it'll add workload we can't spare. You have experience with reading people. If you have concerns about any passengers or crew, we'd prefer to know." Steven paused. He had expected turbulence, instrument issues, maybe even a diversion, but not this. "You want me to scan the cabin for behavioral risks," he said slowly. "Yes," the captain confirmed. "We need stability. If something is brewing out there, I'd rather prevent it than respond to it in the middle of a systems problem." Steven considered. He'd spent his life analyzing danger, faces, tension, posture, inconsistencies. Airports, film sets, diplomatic trips. He'd learned to spot trouble before it erupted. He gave a single nod. "I'll take a walk." Daniel escorted him back out. As the cockpit door sealed shut behind him, Steven paused in the forward galley, letting his senses adjust. He didn't have weapons. He didn't have authority. But he had presence and perception. Time to use both. Row 1 to 10. Business class was mostly quiet. Passengers absorbed in movies, noise-canceling headphones, or sleep. A woman in 3A kept glancing at the window every few minutes, but her breathing was normal, just nervous. A man in 5C gripped his armrests tightly, classic fear of flying. Nothing dangerous. Row 11 to 20. The cabin grew more restless. A teenager whispered anxiously to his mother. A middle-aged man typed rapidly on a laptop, frustration etched across his forehead. 2 friends argued quietly about whether the aircraft had dropped too suddenly earlier. But none of them were unstable. Just uneasy. When Steven reached row 21, he saw her. Meow. She stood stiffly near the galley, pretending to organize plastic cups. Her jaw was tight. Shoulders raised. Breathing shallow. Stress. Guilt. Fragility. Steven approached. She immediately looked away. "You're scared?" he said quietly. She startled. "No. I'm just scared," he repeated, but gentler. "And that's okay. But you can't break again. Not tonight." Her throat bobbed. "I won't." "You'll need support," Steven said. "Who's your closest crew member?" "Daniel," she whispered instantly. He covered for me." "Then stick with him," Steven advised. "Don't isolate. Isolation cracks people." Merrill nodded quickly. Steven continued down the aisle. Row 22 to 33. Here the atmosphere thickened. Passengers who witnessed the slap incident were still unsettled. Whispering. Staring. A few kept glancing at the cockpit door as if expecting someone to burst out with bad news. Steven slowed at row 33. The mother and her child. The little boy looked better, calmer, but still clung to his mother's arm. She gave Steven a weary nod of gratitude. He returned it with understanding before moving on. Row 34 to 45, rear cabin. This was where energy shifted. Two men in row 37 spoke in low, intense voices, leaning close, guarding their expressions. Not aggressive, but tense. One kept checking his watch despite having nowhere to be. Suspicious? Or just anxious travelers? Steven watched them subtly. Their eyes darted around the cabin too often. Their posture rigid. Their bags kept close to their legs. Something wasn't right. He kept walking but stored their faces in memory. As he neared the rear galley, the aircraft gave a small, abrupt shudder. Passengers murmured nervously. Steven steadied himself with one hand on the seat back. A moment later, Daniel appeared beside him. "Did you feel that?" Daniel whispered. "Yes," Steven said. "Air or equipment?" "We don't know yet," Daniel admitted. Steven glanced back toward row 37, then at Daniel. "We might have another problem," he said quietly. Daniel's eyes widened. "Cabin-related?" Steven nodded once. "Possibly." And then, ding, the intercom crackled to life. Chief Purser Daniel to the cockpit immediately. Daniel swallowed hard. Steven's jaw tightened. And the tension inside Flight 482 thickened once again. Daniel hurried toward the cockpit, leaving Steven standing in the rear galley with the soft hum of the aircraft pressing against his ears. The lights flickered for half a second, barely noticeable, but enough to make a few passengers stiffen in their seats. Steven looked down the aisle again. Row 37. The two men sat unnaturally still now, hands clasped, eyes straight ahead. Not talking. Not moving. Almost too controlled. Their sudden calm made Steven's instincts sharpen. But he couldn't act on instinct alone. Not on a plane at 36,000 feet. He stepped back into the aisle, letting the soft vibration of the aircraft settle around him. Flight attendants whispered quietly, tension tightening the air like an invisible rope. Then the intercom clicked on again. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We're experiencing minor technical issues with one of our communication channels. There's no need for alarm, but we ask that you remain seated." It wasn't a terrifying announcement, but it wasn't reassuring either. A murmur rippled through the cabin. Steven kept moving forward, scanning faces, body language, breathing patterns. Fear he expected. Panic he understood. But deliberate stillness, over-controlled behavior, was different. He stopped at row 32 to get a better view without drawing attention. The two men didn't look like friends. They didn't look like ordinary passengers either. Their eyes had a strange focus, less like tourists and more like watchers. Observers. Steven leaned against a seat back, pretending to check overhead bins. His eyes flicked toward row 37 again. One of the men noticed, and lowered his gaze. Too quickly. Too defensive. Steven exhaled slowly. Something was off. He needed confirmation. He searched the cabin for clues, bags, clothing, anything unusual. Then he saw it. A backpack beneath the window seat of row 37. Not suspicious by itself, but the way it was positioned, pulled halfway out as if someone had checked it recently, caught his attention. He continued down the aisle until he reached Meryl again near the mid-galley. She looked steadier now, though her hands trembled when she passed cups to a passenger. Steven leaned in slightly. "Stay with Daniel when he comes back," he murmured. She nodded. Then quietly she whispered, "Something feels wrong back there, doesn't it?" Steven didn't answer. He didn't need to. In the cockpit, Daniel slipped inside. The captain looked more strained than before, sweat beading near his hairline. "Another signal drop," Malik said quickly. "It happened the same moment the turbulence hit." "That's not a coincidence," the captain muttered. Daniel frowned. "Is this becoming dangerous?" "Not yet," Malik said. "But we are losing layers of redundancy. And that is not a good sign over the Atlantic." The captain turned sharply. "Where's Mr. Seagal now?" "Walking the cabin," Daniel replied. "Good," the captain said. "We may need him sooner than we thought." Back in the cabin. Passengers shifted nervously as another brief jolt rippled through the aircraft. Drinks trembled. Overhead lights flickered again. A baby started crying. Someone whispered a prayer. The mother in row 33 clutched her boy tightly. Steven moved down the aisle again, using the turbulence as an excuse to steady himself near suspicious passengers. Row 37. Both men flinched during the jolt, but not in fear. More like irritation. Like the shaking was interfering with something. He stepped closer. "Everything okay, gentlemen?" Steven asked calmly. The man near the aisle forced a tight smile. "Fine." The other didn't look at him. "Lots of turbulence tonight," Steven said casually. No response. Steven's eyes dropped to the backpack. So. But too intentional. As he stepped away, the aisle man whispered something to his partner. The whisper was sharp. Urgent. Then both men shifted in their seats, not panicked but bracing. Steven's pulse tightened. They were preparing for something. He moved toward the galley and caught a flight attendant's attention. "Where's Daniel?" Steven asked quietly. "The cockpit called him," she whispered. "What? What's happening?" "Stay calm," Steven said, "but don't let anyone stand up." The attendant nodded, eyes widening. Another jolt, stronger this time. Passengers gasped. A tray slid off a cart. Someone shouted, "What's going on?" The captain's voice returned. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated." Panic started tightening the cabin. Nervous voices, shifting bodies, rising tension. Pressure building like steam in a sealed pipe. Steven placed a hand on the back of an empty seat, steadying himself. And then, he saw something. Row 37. The aisle man reached down. Not casually. Not naturally. But with intention. His fingers brushed the backpack zipper. Steven's heartbeat kicked. He took one step forward. Then another. And then, a loud, sharp pop sounded from the rear of the cabin. Passengers screamed. Lights flickered violently. The aircraft dropped with a sudden lurch. And everything inside Flight 482 spiraled toward chaos.